I have a set of adjectives and nouns to describe the energy business. It's a highly capitalized, multi-trillion-dollar per year commodity business in the sense that when we flick the switch on, we don't see whether it came from a coal plant or a solar panel. It is a business with incredibly well-developed supply chains. It serves every activity in society. It therefore does and always will invite extensive regulation and very complex politics. That does not start out with your formula for a deft, fast adapting system. But that's the system we need to innovate within. There is the famous expression with the Saudi oil minister, which I believe has contained in it a lot of wisdom, when he said that the Stone Age did not end for lack of stones, and the oil age will not end for lack of oil. So oil will be here for a long time, particularly because it provides an incomparably convenient transportation fuel, gasoline or diesel. The real problem today, in terms of security, is that we essentially have no choice for our transportation fuel. It's oil. Whereas contrast that to the electricity sector, where we have nuclear, coal, gas, wind, solar in the future, geothermal, hydro, and hour by hour, choices are made about which fuel is used. Yeah. In the transportation sector, essentially, you got one. If you have biofuels, you have electricity with plug-in hybrids eventually, et cetera. Then we have that flexibility, or so-called elasticity, and security is improved, emissions can be improved if we have clean electricity sources, et cetera. Well, I think biofuels is certainly going to have a significant place in the transportation market. In most cases, we simply have to move away from the fuel-food competition. In the United States, unfortunately, we do have that with using corn. I think that the science and the technology are very, very promising in terms of using other non-food feedstocks. Technology solution clearly has to be marginal lands, energy, biomass that requires little water to produce it, adapted to very, very different regions. It's not going to be, again, one size fits all. The plants will be very, very different for different climates. And ultimately, I think the market and the economics are going to determine it. And that's where, again, cost reduction. It's as true here in the use of so-called cellulosic mass for biofuels as it is for solar, as it is for carbon capture and sequestration. Cost, cost, cost. It's a big challenge today. We don't have the batteries at the appropriate cost and weight to compete with the range of our personal auto. On the other hand, we should not ignore the advantages of electrification. First of all, it's a pretty good performance vehicle. If you want torque, get a battery. Secondly, it is clean in terms of the quotes tailpipe emissions. So particularly in cities where range is not important and pollution can be important, there's an advantage. There's another kind of pollution that we haven't really spoken about very much: noise. If we could imagine in an urban environment a significant transformation to electric vehicles, that would be a different city.
Yes. Well, we're sitting here in Cambridge and you can hear the trucks going by.
Right.
You wouldn't. Other than the water.
Correct. And then, if you really were confident about that, that could change how you design your buildings. Maybe you wouldn't have to have all the windows hermetically sealed, for example. So anyway, I think there are, I think it'll be a very interesting transition over the next couple of decades towards a different mix in the vehicle fleet.
Interesting.
Well, for the United States, the direct issue, obviously, is oil imports. The issue there is, can we reduce our oil dependence substantially? However, I want to caution that reducing our oil dependence does not immediately translate into reducing oil imports. The reason we import oil is because we're making economic choices. There is certainly a myth that somehow if we stopped importing oil, prices would go down. It's quite the contrary, because nobody is forcing us to buy that oil. It's an economic decision, okay? Now, you could say there's a security premium in reducing imports, but I would say the main thing is that we want to maintain something that has happened really quite successfully, which is increased diversity of supply.
Yep.
In the 1970s, we did not have diversity of supply. Today, it's remarkable how supply diversity has increased with a global market. The United States is the second largest energy producer in the world. We're third in oil. I think we're second in gas. We're second in coal. We're somewhere there in uranium. And of course, we have lots of renewable nuclear. We have the largest fleet in the world. We are an enormous energy producing country. We are also an enormous energy consuming country, which shows up in our oil imports. We need to somehow find the right mix where it's not one size fits all.
Absolutely.
The stakes are high. We got to get it right, but we got to get it right on the environmental side too. And that's where the clock is ticking, and we don't have time to wait forever to establish our programs. Coal, of course, is a very widely used fuel, particularly for the power sector, with the U.S., China, and India combined using about 60% of the world's coal. So if we're going forward, particularly with carbon control in the future, we simply have to figure out a way to employ coal. The answer has to be then, for a serious solution, the ability to capture carbon dioxide and sequester it underground. The problem right now is cost. Today, we would probably be adding 6, 7, 8 cents per kilowatt hour to electricity produced by coal.
And that's on top of what? Just for my
well, in
the
terms
audience of my mother.
for a brand new coal plant, a new coal plant that was built, we're probably talking on top of 6 to 7 cents. So let's call it a doubling of the cost at the plant of production of electricity. We might or might not be willing to pay that in the United States, but it is very difficult to understand China and India being willing to pay this kind of a premium. Do I believe we could start today safely injecting millions of tons into an appropriate reservoir? Absolutely. That's a different statement, however, to do it for 30, 40, 50 years, and I think those things will just work out as we do it. The other near-term issue is that we really have very little idea as to how to regulate, how to assign liability. The Environmental Protection Agency is in fact working on this, but certainly it cannot be based, in my view, on the old types of regulatory structures put in place for water injection, for example.
So what does a carbon price mean to the consumer in terms of their cost of electricity?
Certainly, it will never be cheaper to capture and store CO2 than it is to release it into the atmosphere. So the reason we're doing it, in fact, is because carbon will have a price, and ultimately it has to be cheaper to capture and store it than to release it and pay a price. If we start really squeezing down on carbon dioxide over the next few decades, well, that could double. It could eventually triple. And what I believe is
But an upward trend.
I think inevitably, if we squeeze down on carbon, we squeeze up on the cost. It brings along with it a push towards efficiency. It brings along with it a push towards clean technologies in a conventional pollution sense.
Yep.
It brings along with it a push towards security, because after all, the security issues revolve around carbon-bearing fuels. Now, I think it's very important, again, that any funds associated with that be recycled efficiently to productive uses.
Yeah.
And to address distributional questions, because the poor may get hit harder.
Right.
So so it's there's a lot of work to do there. But I think in the end, if you take one simple thing, that's the direction I think that we need to go in.
Yeah.
Natural gas clearly has a very, very important role going forward, including in a world in which carbon emissions are restrained, because it has roughly half of the emissions of a coal plant. In fact, when you consider that the efficiency of these natural gas plants is also very high, it's really more like, say, 40% of the emissions of a typical coal plant. So there's a great premium there. It's also worth remembering that when we talk about natural gas, it's very different from, let's say, nuclear power or coal or wind, which are essentially electricity producers. Mm-hmm. Whereas gas has three major uses, which have a very, very different dynamic. It's, of course, used for heating. A lot of people heat their homes with natural gas. Then you have a second, which is electricity. The third major area is an industry. It's a major heat source, process material in industries, make ammonia, make chemicals, all kinds of things. And then in addition, there's a lot of discussion in transportation. Today, of course, it has substantial use in things like bus fleets in cities, some taxi fleets as well. So if you're in a place with a good refueling infrastructure, it's cleaner burning and can be quite effective, which emphasizes what a valuable and flexible commodity it is. Congress is moving towards requiring more supervision over these fracturing processes. It is certainly, I would say, not clear to me today that there have been major consequences, but I think this is an area where what we need is good, objective measurements, analysis, understand where the fluids are going. To be honest, this is a case where often the companies have not helped themselves, arguing for proprietary reasons. They don't want to tell you what they're putting in to the fracking. I think that is just A, improper, and B, not very good public relations. So I think what we need is just an honest, scientifically based evaluation, and then whatever measures are required for environmental protection will be taken. Nuclear power, as with any no or low carbon option, needs to be understood by the marketplace in terms of its cost and performance. So I think building a few plants with some government assistance in this decade is justified and is important. It is not a statement of endorsing a tripling of nuclear power or any other alternative. It's a statement that I believe the marketplace has to understand what is the option, what is the cost with nuclear power, what is the option with coal and carbon capture and sequestration, what is the option with offshore wind, what is the option with hot rock geothermal. All of these options, I believe, these low carbon options, I think the government should be supporting it so that 10 years from now, we'll know what the options are.
Yeah.
First of all, I think the preferred approach for nuclear spent fuel management today should be managing it for at least the order of 100 years. That is not a punt. It is actually what we should be doing.
Managing it meaning keeping it available, and it could have different uses, or eventually we store it.
Managing it in dry storage, we know can be done for a very, very long time. Secondly, it's cheap. Third, while you're doing that, the stuff is cooling off, radioactivity is going down. You're only making life easier in a certain sense, right? But at the same time, it preserves options. If you want to put it in a mined repository, okay, put it there in 100 years rather than today. We may want to take the fuel apart and reuse the stuff that has energy value. And so preserving options inexpensively is worth a lot. It's the right way to go.
So wind is really out in front in terms of the renewable energies today. Do you see that scaling, and what are some of the wind's challenges in terms of materials and other kinds of issues?
Well, I think as we're seeing with wind, siting is a major issue.
Just because people don't want it?
Because a lot of people don't want to see them on ridge lines, for example. They like the view. Of course, in New England, we've had the famous issues with a major offshore project called Cape Wind, where everybody likes the idea of having carbon-free energy, but there are issues of sight lines. And so this is a major issue. Now, of course, wind, on the other hand, if you're out in the Great Plains, a lot of wind, and often ranchers, farmers seem to enjoy having kind of a revenue stream from having the wind turbines while they still can use the land around it for agriculture or for other purposes. So I think, it's going to be, again, it's going to be site by site in terms of where we can go with these turbines. Then the issues of grid management, unless you have cheap storage, becomes an issue. If we had a modernized grid, especially for high voltage across long distances, then a lot of the siting issues would be relaxed, and we could provide more generation of the type that we want. I will admit to being very bullish on solar in the long term. It just has so many attractive features, including the fact that even though it's intermittent, at least it tends to be on when you want it. But there are other issues. For example, for the large utility scale solar thermal plants, they have to be in places that have very clear, direct sunshine, not kind of, reflected stuff, which you can get away with more easily with photovoltaics. Well, when you start narrowing that down, let's say the United States, you see that it's not a solution everywhere. It's a solution in large parts of the Southwest. And then, however, you're in the old problem. Typically, you're far from demand. You still require some water. That can be a challenge. And so all of these things, as I say, there's no one size fits all.
Can you just give me the different ways we're going to need to get better at storing energy?
We do have the hoary old expression about necessity being the mother of invention. And I think if we are pushing the limits where storage is going to be needed, I think we'll get a lot of creative solutions. There's physical storage. Pumped water would be an example. Flywheels are an example. So you can store energy physically. You can store energy chemically. So a battery, for example, is chemical storage. But also you can store in fuels. So, for example, and perhaps we'll come back to this, if you had a great way of inexpensively splitting water with sunlight into hydrogen and oxygen, you have solved storage at the same time. Because you can just store the hydrogen and oxygen. If you want electricity, put them into a fuel cell. If you want a fuel, put it into a fuel cell in a car, for example. The most important thing is lowering your use of energy in ways that actually save you money. It goes from simple behavioral things. It sounds trivial, but putting out lights really does matter. I think it is not understood that 70% of our electricity use in the United States goes into residential and commercial buildings. And this is enormous. And electricity is where all the coal plants
Exactly.
are working. It is, in fact, improving the efficiency of one's house, the obvious things with insulation and windows, et cetera. Again, I'm not going to go through all the litany of the obvious things, but just to emphasize, these are steps that save money with typically a short payback period. They do not decrease and may even increase comfort. They save energy, they save emissions, they're good for the climate, they're good for security, they're good for your pocketbook. That's the place to start.
Right.
Then, of course, there is the issue of being a citizen in terms of being aware of the political discussions going on, listening to what candidates and office holders are saying and doing, and supporting them in what are sometimes difficult decisions, but those that will, in the long term, enhance the public good, enhance our security, and certainly enhance and protect the environment.